Ghost. Infestissumam. A Latin word meaning hostile. And thus far, from what I've been able to tell, this has been a review that has definitely garnered some hostility. You remember Ghost a couple of years ago. Whenever Opus Eponymous came out, it was one that was subject to rave reviews. This was a band that seemed to have this 70s Blue Oyster Cult, Black Sabbath-esque awareness to them that was able to reflect that musical element to a new generation. And here in 2013, with this new album, their sophomore effort, it was meant to continue the tidal wave of momentum that they have already been able to gain in just a couple of short years. This album was highly anticipated by many people. This was a metal event, and still shall be a metal event whenever it is released on April the 16th here in America. Now, this should have already been out. I'm going to say that right now. This should have been out on Tuesday. I should have been talking about this a couple of days ago. However, thanks to some distributors that didn't exactly like the little layer cover that was going to go on the CD, the depiction that was on there, because there's a little Jesus on the little upside-down cross. Here in America, on the deluxe edition, we have to wait a week. But that's okay, because if you order a vinyl copy, you're still getting the original little cover that was supposed to go on the vinyl. No questions asked. You'll still have what was intended by the band for you to see. But now let's talk about the music. Let's dive in to a record that some people have been very polarized about thus far. In all of the chatter that I have heard, from one direction or the other, I've heard everything, all sorts of words, from boring, dull, slump, pretty good, decent, to awesome. Now you might think that that's typically what happens with albums of this nature, or all albums. However, this is actually more of a rarity. Typically, whenever I hear chatter before I do a review, the feelings are relatively universal. Does that necessarily sway me? Hell no. So let's talk about this. After the success of Opus Eponymous, you would think that Ghost would want to come out with all guns blazing. You would think that after the rip-roaring events that they've done and the tours that they have concluded with bands such as Opeth and Mastodon, that they would want to get back into the studio and write a record that had just as much power and zest as the original. And here's the funny part about it. In a way they have, but in a much different style, in a much different format. Whereas the first record really had a tremendous awareness to bands, as I mentioned in the introduction, as Blue Oyster Cult and Black Sabbath. It seems as though this album has a lot more awareness to the proggier, more artistic side of the 1970s. Bands like the Moody Blues come to mind. They were going to initially include an ABBA cover of I'm a Marionette, and other groups such as maybe even Jethro Tull can even be thrown into the mix. Now, this is almost like a tale of two sides of the album. I hate to say it. I really hate to really dissect albums like that. I last did that, I believe, with the Periphery release from 2012, Periphery 2. However, it really needs to be done because up until you get to Ghuleh / Zombie Queen, this is an album that tends to go very little in the way of places. The introduction is extremely solid. It definitely gives you a really heightened and elated feeling that, the time had finally come for new Ghost material, and you really hope that they would just, thrash right into it. You would hope that they would really just hit you right out of the gate, and it really doesn't seem like it happens. It almost reminds me of a boxer who kind of lolls and lingers and kind of sizes up his opponent for the first couple of rounds, and then after that size-up process, if he hasn't been knocked out yet, that's whenever he begins to mount his offense. That's when he really starts to become aggressive. And that's what this album sort of does, but the allegory and the metaphor don't work very well because instead of becoming exceptionally aggressive, this is an album that becomes tremendously trippy and very, very prog-minded. I really cite Ghuleh / Zombie Queen as the true turn for this album, and I also cite this song as probably one of the best songs that I've heard thus far in 2013, principally because it has this tremendous, tremendous awareness to it. It's constructed very, very well. There's a very carnival-like atmosphere to it. There is an exceptional amount of mantra to it. And not to mention, I have to say, the overall construction of this track was done very, very well. As you move on through the second half, it seems to linger a little bit, but not as much as it probably should. Body and Blood is another tremendous song that really is a highlight of the second half of this record. And you have to understand something, folks. Whereas most of you probably listened to the new Ghost tracks, Year Zero and Secular Haze, I didn't do that. I actually opted for it to remain rather virginal. And to be perfectly honest, I was kind of happy that I did that. I had the feeling that if I wouldn't have done that, I would have approached this album with a whole lot more worry than perhaps I initially did. And after talking to a lot of people, that worry certainly did still surface. However, it was still one of those things where, you know, people were just talking that talk. And then we get to the epic finale of Monstrance Clocks, which once again really shows a real Moody Blues-like atmosphere. And let me tell you, these three tracks that I have specifically mentioned, Ghuleh/Zombie Queen, Body and Blood, and Monstrance Clocks, these are three of the real highlights of an album that really, overall, aside from that, is unfortunately quite underwhelming. It's an album that seems that it goes, you know, it has all the potential to go in various different ways. It's an album that definitely seems like it could have built to a lot more with some of its constructions. It's definitely one where there seems to have been a simpler approach on some tracks that kind of form these like bookends compared to the, you know, the real highlights that have been mentioned. And with that, it's really kind of an unfortunate scenario, because unfortunately, no matter how good 3 songs are, 3 songs do not make a 10-song album. Whenever it comes to the building process of this record, I really don't know exactly how it happened. However, this is supposed to be a logical, you know, continuance of Opus Eponymous. Whereas with the very last track on that album, we saw the rise, the birth of the Antichrist. This is supposed to be kind of the Antichrist's path after that. And really, if you want to look at it that way, it sounds kind of, you know, dull in some portions, in some places. But there's a lot of places here where it also really shines forth. I'm telling you what, the prog awareness that is on this record is certainly something to be marveled. There are definitely a lot of allegories to bands from the 70s that not many people here in 2013 would be willing to touch. I don't see a lot of people and a lot of bands out there really aiming their best to be like Jethro Tull or the Moody Blues. It definitely seems like something that had its topicality, that had its relevance in the 1970s. However, in, you know, decades since, has kind of fallen out of practicality. However, with this album, with these songs, the ones that I have mentioned, they definitely are able to revitalize a genuine interest, perhaps, in the Moody Blues and a genuine interest in Jethro Tull. Only they kind of do it in a way that sounds like these bands, all they did was worship Satan. Yeah. Consider bands also such as Strawberry Alarm Clock, you know. Consider, you know, Seals and Crofts and, you know, bands of that nature. There's a definite little sense of poppiness here with some of these tracks, and that actually is kind of a nice touch. It actually brings a very morbid sort of curiosity to this album. It actually creates this, you know, allegory that, you know, music that has this sort of dynamisty to it doesn't necessarily all have to be about traits or things that are positive. Either that, or if it's going to be on the negative side, it doesn't always have to be about heartbreak or murder. Instead, this is something that's all about the dark, the evil. Something very, very buried deep inside lore that, for Ghost at least, or Ghost BC here in America, it's an evil that's awakened, it's an evil that has been summoned, it is an evil that through ritual has now descended upon our world. Overall, this album actually feels kind of like a, I don't know, it's kind of like taking a shower. And whenever it starts, you have plenty of hot water, and then it suddenly turns cold. So you have to crank up, you know, the hot water a little bit, and you get a little spat of hot water, and then all of a sudden it goes cold. So you crank it up a little more, and you get a little spat of hot water, only to have it go cold again. Unfortunately, even though there are some true highlights on this record, it's something that falls exceptionally flat, and it's definitely one where the highlights cannot save the whole. Even though the highlights certainly are some of 2013's earliest highlights, this is an album that I feel is doomed to be kind of buried under the idea of the sophomore slump. It's not necessarily nearly as bad as some people have painted it to be. However, by comparison to perhaps the expectations that have been painted for this band, not to mention, after listening to a record such as Opus Eponymous, well, this album does feel as though it falls a little short. However, fear not. There are still a couple of decent tracks on this record that are more than decent. They're, in fact, just ridiculously good, that actually make this record still worth purchasing. seriously, if you have an open mind and really, really enjoy a band's ability to really, make a composition just come alive, then the 3 tracks, once again, that I have mentioned, Ghuleh / Zombie Queen, Body and Blood, and Monstrance Clocks, rather, will really speak to you and will make this record by itself worth purchasing. However, as a whole, this is going to be one that is probably going to fall on a lot of sour tongues. It's going to be one that's certainly going to have its share of problems, its share of anger, and its share of disappointment. Unfortunately for this album, I can only grant it 3 stars out of 5. I can only give it about a 7, at the very most. And that's because even though there are some amazing moments, it's just not amazing all around. Unfortunately, I do have to sit here and say that Ghost, one of my newer favorite bands, has kind of let me down. However, it has delivered for me some tremendous moments here in 2013 that certainly will be memorable. Certainly things that I will remember come December. But as a whole, this album does fall flat. I have unfortunately succumbed to the fact that this is a sophomore slump. But remember, folks, a sophomore slump is typically just one album. It typically does not plague an entire career. So don't write off Ghost just yet. Look at the highlights of this album. Consider those highlights spattered around other highlights, as opposed to being spattered around just halfway average tracks. What you're going to find there is that the best may actually still be yet to come. Because as they dive deeper and deeper into their voyage into the 70s, their voyage into evil, their voyage into the antichrist, we may find that the results that we hear after this album, after this one hiccup, may truly amaze us.